The frozen shadows. The air was crisp and cold, the kind that filled your lungs and left a faint chill in your chest, even after you exhaled. Mark Hastings, a seasoned police captain from New York, gripped the steering wheel of their SUV with a sense of relief mixed with anticipation. This family trip to the Canadian wilderness had been long overdue, a rare escape from the hustle and noise of city life. Beside him sat his wife, Lisa, who watched the snowy landscape roll past with a soft smile, her fingers laced through his on the console between them. In the back seat, their daughter, Sarah, sat gazing out the window with a look of pure wonder. At 14, Sarah was smart, bold, and curious, a spark that Mark adored, but also feared, especially out here, where civilization felt like a distant memory. Sarah, despite her urban upbringing, had a love for the outdoors, and this trip was all she had been talking about for weeks. The idea of experiencing untouched nature thrilled her, and for Mark, it was a chance to reconnect as a family and create memories that would endure long after Sarah had grown up. They were heading deeper into northern Canada, where the tall pines stood like silent guardians along the roadside, their branches laden with snow. The dense, quiet forests seemed to swallow up any noise beyond the hum of their SUV, creating a strange, still atmosphere that made Mark feel like they were entering another world. There was no phone reception this far out, and it gave him an eerie sense of isolation. Still, he pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on his excitement for what lay ahead. "Are we almost there?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Her eyes were wide with excitement, and Mark couldn't help but chuckle at her impatience. "Almost, kiddo," he said, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Just a few more miles, and we'll be setting up camp. Think you can last that long?" Sarah rolled her eyes, feigning exasperation. "I think I can manage, Dad. But I'm not making any promises." Lisa laughed, reaching back to ruffle Sarah's hair. "You'd better hold on. Your father went all out for this trip. It's not every day you get to spend a weekend in a cabin by a frozen lake." As they rounded a bend, the narrow road led them to a pull-off area near the edge of a sprawling forest. Mark parked the car, and they stepped out into the biting air. Their breath formed small, misty clouds as they unloaded their gear and set off down a narrow path, lined with towering trees whose snow-covered branches swayed gently in the wind. Every crunch of their boots on the packed snow seemed to echo through the stillness, and even Sarah quieted, absorbing the vastness of their surroundings. After a short hike, they arrived at the cabin nestled near the edge of a frozen lake. The cabin was a cozy structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a steep, snow-covered roof. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, evidence that the ranger Mark had hired to prepare the cabin had done his job well. The sight of the warm cabin against the backdrop of snow and trees brought a collective sigh of contentment from the family. Inside, they set down their bags and shook off the cold, breathing in the scent of wood and pine that filled the room. Mark began building a fire, and soon a cozy warmth filled the cabin, driving away the chill that clung to them from outside. "Let's check out the lake," Sarah said eagerly, barely able to contain herself. "Not so fast, young lady," Mark replied, smiling. "Let's unpack and get settled first. We'll go outside once the sun's a little lower. It'll look even better in the evening light." Sarah reluctantly agreed, and they spent the next hour unpacking and organizing. Lisa prepared hot cocoa for everyone, and soon they were ready to venture outside. Bundled in thick jackets, gloves, and scarves, they stepped out into the fading light, which cast an enchanting orange glow over the snow-covered landscape. The lake stretched out before them, smooth and glassy, the ice reflecting the colors of the setting sun like a mirror. Sarah was the first to run out, her boots crunching in the snow as she made her way to the lake's edge. "Careful, Sarah," Mark called, watching her with a protective gaze. But he knew she was responsible and wouldn't go too far. As they wandered around the edge of the lake, a strange sense of quiet settled over them. The forest around the lake stood tall and dark, the trees casting long shadows over the ice. Everything seemed serene, untouched, a picture-perfect moment that they all would remember for years to come. Or so Mark thought. Just as they were about to head back toward the cabin, a figure appeared at the edge of the trees across the lake, silhouetted against the fading light. Mark's instincts sharpened immediately. The man wore a uniform, which Mark recognized as the dark blue of the local police. A sense of reassurance washed over him briefly, though something about the way the officer stood, watching them in silence, felt unsettling. The officer began walking toward them, crossing the ice with steadied, deliberate steps. Mark noticed Sarah glancing curiously at the man as he approached. Something about the officer's body language struck Mark as odd. There was a stiffness, a tension in the man's posture that didn't seem quite right. As he neared, Mark got a clearer look at him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with pale skin and sharp features. His gaze was hard, his expression unreadable as he nodded in their direction. "Evening," the officer said, his voice gruff and clipped. His eyes settled on Sarah with a look that was hard to interpret, a mix of curiosity and something colder. "Good evening, officer," Mark replied, stepping slightly in front of Sarah. "We're just here for a family trip. Thought we'd enjoy the beauty of the area for a few days." The officer gave a slight nod, his gaze flicking over each of them. "You're not from around here, are you?" His tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something unwelcoming. "No, we're just visiting from New York," Mark replied, keeping his tone polite. "Wanted to get away from the city for a bit." The officer's lips twisted into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We don't get many visitors up here. Most folks know this area isn't exactly friendly to outsiders." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the hostility beneath the officer's words. "We're just here to enjoy the scenery," he said, keeping his tone even. "I'm sure we'll be careful and respectful of the area." "See that you are," the officer replied, his gaze lingering on Sarah a moment too long before he turned and walked back toward the trees. As the officer disappeared into the forest, an uneasy silence fell over them. Mark felt a chill run down his spine, though it had little to do with the cold. "Dad, who was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just a local officer, sweetheart," Mark replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "But if you see him again, don't approach him alone, okay?" Sarah nodded, sensing the seriousness in her father's voice. Back at the cabin, as they settled in for the evening, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The officer's gaze, the strange tension in his words, it all left an unsettling impression on him. He tried to brush it off as just a local's distrust of tourists, but his instincts told him there was more to it. The next morning, they woke to a winter wonderland outside, with fresh snow blanketing the trees and the lake shimmering under the early morning light. Sarah, eager to explore, pulled on her coat and scarf and bounded out the door before Mark or Lisa could remind her to stay close. Mark stepped out onto the porch, watching her with a smile as she wandered toward the lake's edge. He knew she wouldn't go far, but his protective instincts made him keep an eye on her. He glanced back inside, where Lisa was setting up breakfast, and called over his shoulder, "I'll keep an eye on her while you finish up." "Thanks, honey," Lisa replied with a smile. Mark took a few steps toward the lake, watching Sarah as she gazed out over the frozen surface. The morning light was breathtaking, casting a silvery glow over everything, and he felt a brief sense of peace wash over him. But as he looked out at the tree line, a shadow moved, catching his attention. The officer was back, standing at the edge of the forest, watching Sarah with the same cold expression as before. Mark's gut twisted with a sense of foreboding as he realized that this wasn't a chance encounter. This man was here for a reason, and Mark intended to find out why. The stranger's warning. The morning sun cast long beams over the lake, the light flickering across the frozen surface in a way that would have been beautiful if not for the tense feeling hanging in the air. Mark watched as Sarah continued exploring the lake's edge, her excitement visible even from afar. But his gaze was locked on the dark figure standing at the tree line. still and imposing, like a statue in the snow. The man's gaze was fixed on Sarah, an intensity in his eyes that sent a chill down Mark's spine. Mark took a breath to steady himself and then, trying not to alarm Sarah, called out to her in a calm voice. "Sarah, sweetheart, why don't you come back here? Breakfast is almost ready." Sarah glanced back at him with a hint of disappointment but obeyed, making her way carefully across the snow-covered ground. She hadn't noticed the man watching her, and Mark didn't want to frighten her unnecessarily. But he knew he couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at him. As Sarah reached him, he took her hand, guiding her back toward the cabin. She gave him a puzzled look, sensing his tension. "Dad, is something wrong?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "But remember, if you go out, just stay close to the cabin. It's easy to get lost out here." Sarah nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "Okay, Dad." Once inside, Mark watched Sarah join Lisa at the table, her attention shifting to breakfast and the warmth of the cabin. But his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the officer's presence than just a local suspicion of tourists. It was the way he looked at Sarah, with an expression that was both intense and unnerving. After breakfast, as Sarah and Lisa began to tidy up, Mark quietly slipped on his coat and boots. He glanced back at Lisa, giving her a look that she immediately understood. "Be careful," she said softly, her eyes filled with concern. Mark nodded. "I'm just going to have a word with our friend in the woods." Stepping outside, Mark made his way toward the spot where he had last seen the officer. The snow crunched under his boots, and the air was bitterly cold, but his focus was unwavering. As he reached the edge of the forest, he spotted the man standing just beyond the tree line, his figure partially obscured by shadows. The officer watched him approach, his expression unreadable. Mark stopped a few feet away, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Morning again, officer. I didn't catch your name yesterday." The man gave a slight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Deputy Kent," he replied, his voice as cold as the air around them. "I didn't expect to see you out here so early." Mark studied him, noting the way his gaze flicked toward the cabin, where he knew Lisa and Sarah were watching through the window. "I'd like to know why you were out here watching my family," Mark said, keeping his tone even. "It feels like more than just curiosity." Kent's expression didn't change, but a glint of something hard flashed in his eyes. "Just doing my job, Mr. Hastings. Keeping an eye on things." Mark's jaw clenched. "And what exactly do you need to keep an eye on?" Kent shrugged, his gaze drifting back toward the lake. "Things aren't always what they seem around here, Mr. Hastings. You might think you're just passing through, but locals don't take kindly to people wandering into places they don't belong." Mark's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "We're not causing any trouble, just here to enjoy a family trip. But I don't appreciate anyone, especially a local officer, staring at my daughter like that." Kent let out a low chuckle, and the sound sent a chill down Mark's spine. "Careful there, Captain. You don't know much about this place or the people in it. And if you're smart, you'll keep to yourselves." The words were a warning, plain and simple. Mark's instincts screamed at him that this man was dangerous, that there was something lurking beneath the surface. But he couldn't walk away without making it clear that his family was off limits. "Listen to me, Deputy," Mark said, his voice low and filled with the authority that had kept order on New York streets for years. "I don't know what's going on here. And frankly, I don't care. But if you come near my family again, there will be consequences. Understood?" For a moment, Kent's expression hardened, a flash of anger crossing his face. But then he smiled again, a cold, twisted smile. "Have it your way, Captain. But remember, you're a long way from home. Out here, things don't work the same way they do in the city." With that, Kent turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Mark standing alone in the snow, his heart pounding. The encounter had only deepened his unease, but he knew that confronting Kent further would be a mistake. For now, he had to focus on keeping his family safe and close by. As he walked back to the cabin, Mark's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. It wasn't just Kent's words that bothered him, but the look in his eyes. The look of a man who enjoyed instilling fear, who thrived on his power over others. Mark had seen men like that before, and he knew they were often more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Back inside, Lisa greeted him with a worried look. "Is everything okay?" Mark forced a reassuring smile. "Nothing to worry about. Just a little reminder to stay close to the cabin." Sarah, overhearing, looked up with a frown. "Are we not allowed to explore?" The day passed uneventfully, with the family enjoying the snow, building a snowman near the lake, and warming up with hot cocoa back in the cabin. But as night fell, a thick blanket of clouds rolled in, shrouding the landscape in darkness. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the temperature plummeted, making the cabin feel like a fragile barrier between them and the vast, frozen wilderness outside. That night, Mark lay awake, his mind churning with thoughts of Deputy Kent. He knew the man was lurking somewhere nearby, and the thought of him watching his family made his blood boil. He considered calling the local authorities, but out here, so far from any real town, he knew it might be hours before help could arrive. Just after midnight, a noise jolted him from his thoughts, a faint tapping at the cabin door. Lisa stirred beside him, blinking sleepily. "Did you hear that?" she murmured, her voice thick with drowsiness. Mark nodded, immediately on high alert. He slipped out of bed and pulled on his coat, motioning for Lisa to stay put. "I'll check it out. Just stay here with Sarah." He made his way to the door, his hand instinctively resting on the pocket knife he brought with him. The tapping had stopped, and the silence pressed in around him as he reached the door and slowly turned the handle. Outside, the wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a flurry of snowflakes that stung his face. He scanned the area, but the porch was empty. There was no sign of movement, no tracks in the snow beyond his own. For a moment, he wondered if he imagined it, if his tension from earlier had simply gotten the better of him. But then he saw it, a small object lying on the doorstep. Bending down, he picked it up and felt a chill run down his spine. It was a small, rough-carved figure of a bird, whittled from wood, and painted in stark black and white. Mark stared at it, his mind racing. He knew enough about local lore to recognize it. A raven, symbolizing death and bad omens. The next morning, as the first light crept over the horizon, Mark shared his discovery with Lisa. Her face paled as she stared at the carving, a sense of dread filling her eyes. "What do you think it means?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a warning," Mark replied, his voice hard. "Kent's trying to scare us. I don't know what he wants, but it's clear he's not going to stop until we leave." Lisa nodded, her gaze shifting to Sarah, who was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking outside. "Maybe we should go, Mark, if he's this serious." Mark shook his head. "No, if we leave now, he wins, and who knows what he might try to pull if he thinks we're scared." He placed the carving on the table, his gaze hardening. "We'll stay close to the cabin today. I'll keep a watch over Sarah, and we'll take things one step at a time. But if Kent shows up again, I'll be ready." Lisa nodded, though he could see the worry etched on her face. They had come here seeking peace, but it was clear now that they had stepped into something far darker. And as Mark gazed out at the snowy landscape, he felt the weight of the forest's silence pressing in on him, like a warning he could no longer ignore. Shadows in the snow. The following morning dawned gray and overcast, with low-hanging clouds obscuring the sun and casting an eerie pallor over the snow-covered landscape. Mark Hastings awoke early, his mind still preoccupied with the wooden raven figure he'd found on their doorstep the previous night. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a scare tactic. There was something about Deputy Kent's presence, his words, and now this dark omen that made Mark's instincts scream. Something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. After a quick breakfast, Mark called Sarah over. He was gentle, but there was a firmness in his voice that she hadn't heard before. "Sarah, sweetheart, today I want you to stay close to the cabin. Okay? No wandering off, even if you're just going to explore by the lake. Your mom and I want to keep an eye on you." Sarah looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Did I do something wrong, Dad?" "No, not at all," Mark assured her, forcing a smile. "It's just, the weather's unpredictable, and I'd feel better if we all stayed close today." She nodded, though he could tell she sensed his unease. But Sarah was an obedient child, and he knew she would respect his wishes. Lisa watched their exchange quietly, her own worry mirroring his. After their talk, Sarah grabbed her book and settled in by the fire, while Mark and Lisa quietly discussed their plan for the day. "Maybe we should just pack up and leave," Lisa suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't what we signed up for, Mark, and I can't stand the thought of someone watching her." Mark clenched his jaw, torn between his desire to protect his family and his reluctance to let Kent intimidate them into leaving. "I understand, Lisa. But if we leave now, who knows what that man might do? If we stay, I can keep an eye on him. But we'll need to stay vigilant." Lisa's face softened, though he could still see the worry etched in her features. "Then we'll stay. But please, Mark, be careful." After their talk, Mark decided to do a sweep of the area around the cabin. He grabbed his binoculars and set out to explore the woods nearby, careful to stay within sight of the cabin. The snow was thick, blanketing the ground in an undisturbed layer that muffled every sound. As he walked, his eyes scanned the trees, looking for any sign that Kent had been nearby. But aside from the occasional animal tracks and the quiet hush of the wind, he found nothing. The forest was calm, peaceful even, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Mark had experienced this sensation before in his career, a sixth sense, almost, that had saved him on more than one occasion. And right now, it was telling him that Kent was out there, lurking just beyond sight. Mark returned to the cabin after an hour, but the sense of unease had only grown stronger. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that he was just being overcautious, but deep down, he knew better. This wasn't paranoia. This was a real, tangible threat. Inside, Sarah was still curled up by the fire, reading, while Lisa was preparing lunch. Mark sat down with them, trying to act casual, but his mind was racing. He knew he couldn't let his guard down, not even for a moment. Just as they were finishing lunch, a knock came at the door, loud and sudden. Lisa flinched, her eyes widening as she glanced at Mark. He stood up, his heart pounding, and made his way to the door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with Deputy Kent. The man was smiling, though there was no warmth in his expression. His eyes flicked over Mark, then past him to Lisa and Sarah. "Morning, Captain," Kent said, his voice as smooth as ice. "Thought I'd check in on you folks, see how you're enjoying our little slice of paradise." Mark clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. "We're doing just fine, Deputy," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Is there something I can help you with?" Kent's gaze drifted to Sarah, who was watching from across the room. "Just thought I'd let you know about the lake. Ice can be unpredictable this time of year. Wouldn't want anyone falling through now, would we?" Mark's blood ran cold. There was something about the way Kent said it, something in his tone, that felt like more than just a casual warning. "We'll be careful," he replied, his voice steady. "And we'll make sure to stay off the ice." Kent's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good to hear. Wouldn't want any accidents out here. These woods, they can be dangerous if you don't know your way around." Mark took a step forward, blocking Kent's view of his family. "We're aware of the risks, Deputy, but we can take care of ourselves." Kent's smile faded, his expression hardening. "I'm sure you can, Captain. Just remember, out here, things work a little differently than they do in the city." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without another word. Mark closed the door, his hands shaking with barely contained anger. He turned to Lisa, his voice low. We need to stay vigilant. This isn't just some local cop trying to scare us. I don't know what his game is, but he's not going to leave us alone. That afternoon, as a light snowfall dusted the ground, Mark decided to keep watch outside. He set up a chair on the porch, his binoculars at the ready, scanning the tree line for any sign of Kent. Lisa stayed inside with Sarah, keeping her occupied with games and activities to distract her from the tension that had settled over their trip like a dark cloud. Hours passed, the sun beginning to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. Mark's vigilance never wavered, though the silence of the woods seemed to press in around him, amplifying every small noise. The light was beginning to fade when he caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. It was just a flicker, a shadow slipping between the pines, but Mark's instincts kicked in. He raised his binoculars, focusing on the spot where he'd seen the movement. For a moment, he saw nothing, only the dark silhouettes of the trees against the snow. But then, just as he was about to lower the binoculars, he saw him, Kent, standing partially obscured by the trees, watching the cabin with that same cold, unyielding gaze. After nearly an hour of searching, he spotted a faint plume of smoke rising through the trees in the distance. He moved toward it cautiously, his senses on high alert. As he neared, he saw a small, dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees, hidden from view by the dense pines. The smoke rose from a chimney, suggesting that someone was inside. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself, and approached the cabin. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment, the door creaked open, and there stood Deputy Kent, his face a mask of surprise, quickly replaced by a cold smile. Well, Kent said, his tone mocking. What brings you out here, Captain? Mark didn't waste time on pleasantries. We need to talk, Kent. This has gone far enough. Kent leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. I don't know what you're talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Mark replied, his voice low. You've been harassing my family since the moment we arrived, leaving footprints, watching us, even leaving that twisted carving on our doorstep. This is going to stop, one way or another. Kent's smile faded, replaced by a look of disdain. You don't understand, do you? You come out here, to our land, thinking you can just do whatever you want. You're outsiders. People like you don't belong here. Mark felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. We're just here to enjoy the forest, Kent. We haven't done anything to provoke this. Kent's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. This forest doesn't belong to you, Captain. It belongs to those of us who respect it, who understand it. Your family doesn't belong here, and if you know what's good for you, you'll leave before something unfortunate happens. Mark took a step forward, his gaze locked on Kent. Are you threatening me? Kent didn't flinch. I'm just giving you a friendly warning. People like you don't understand what's out here. There are forces in this forest that you can't even begin to comprehend. If you want to keep your family safe, you'll leave. Today. Mark's hands clenched into fists, but he knew that violence wouldn't solve anything. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. I've heard your warning, Kent, but if you come near my family again, there will be consequences. Do you understand? Kent's smile returned, though it was colder than before. We'll see about that, Captain. We'll see. Mark turned and walked away, his pulse racing, but he could feel Kent's gaze on his back, a chilling presence that lingered even as he made his way back to the cabin. When he returned, Lisa was waiting for him at the door, her face etched with worry. Did you find him? Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. He won't leave us alone, Lisa. He wants us gone. He's using fear to try and drive us away. Lisa wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Mark, maybe we should just leave. This place, it doesn't feel safe anymore. Mark placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. I know, honey. But if we leave now, we're giving him exactly what he wants. I think it's more than just him being territorial. There's something else going on here, something he's not telling us." Lisa looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "But what if it's not worth the risk? What if he tries something worse?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Lisa, but I do know that I won't let him intimidate us. We'll stay close to the cabin, and if he shows up again, we'll call for help, even if it means hiking out to find reception." Just as they were discussing their options, Sarah walked into the room, her eyes wide. "Dad, there's someone outside." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He moved to the window, peering out, but saw nothing. "Where did you see them, sweetheart?" Sarah pointed toward the lake. "Over there, by the trees. I thought it was just a shadow, but it looked like someone was watching us." Mark exchanged a glance with Lisa, his face pale. He knew that Sarah wouldn't make something like this up, and he knew that if Kent was watching them, it meant he was only becoming bolder. "Stay inside," he told Sarah, his voice steady but firm. "Don't go near the windows, and keep close to your mom." Lisa nodded, taking Sarah's hand. Mark grabbed his coat, preparing to go outside once more. But as he opened the door, he froze, his breath catching in his throat. On the ground in front of the cabin was another carving, this one larger and more detailed than the raven. It was a figure of a man, dressed in a police uniform, but the face was twisted, deformed, almost monstrous. Mark stared at it, feeling a cold dread settle over him. It was a warning, a message that Kent was done playing games. He picked up the carving, studying it closely. The detail was eerie, almost lifelike, as though it were meant to mock him. Mark's hands trembled with anger as he threw the carving into the snow, his mind racing. He knew they had to get out of here. Kent wasn't just trying to scare them anymore. He was sending a message that he was willing to go to any lengths to make them leave. Mark returned inside, his face set in determination. "We're leaving. Pack whatever you can carry. We're getting out of here now." Lisa nodded, relief washing over her face as she began gathering their belongings. Sarah looked up at him, worry etched in her young face. "Dad, are we in trouble?" Mark knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to be fine, sweetheart, but we're going to leave now, okay?" Sarah nodded, trusting her father completely. As they packed, the wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. Mark glanced outside, feeling a sense of urgency rising within him. He knew they couldn't afford to waste any time. The longer they stayed, the more dangerous this place would become. Once they had everything packed, they hurried outside, making their way toward the SUV parked near the cabin. But as they reached the vehicle, Mark felt his heart sink. The tires were slashed, deep gouges running through the rubber. He stared at the damage, anger and fear coursing through him. "Dad." Sarah's voice was small, frightened. "Can we still leave?" Mark forced himself to stay calm. "We'll hike back to the main road. It's a few miles, but we can make it. I'll carry what we need, and we'll be fine." Lisa looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "Let's go. I just want us to get out of here." They set off down the narrow path leading back toward the road, Mark carrying the bulk of their belongings while Lisa and Sarah walked close behind. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels, and the path was rough and uneven, forcing them to move slowly. The snowfall had intensified, obscuring their view and making the journey even more difficult. But they pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency that pushed them forward, step by step. Mark's mind raced with thoughts of Kent, the twisted carving, the footprints, all of it swirling together in a nightmarish haze. He knew they were being hunted, that Kent wouldn't let them leave without a fight. After nearly an hour of trudging through the snow, they reached a clearing near the road. Mark felt a surge of relief as he spotted the faint outline of the main road through the trees. But just as they were about to step out of the clearing, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Kent. He stood in the center of the clearing, his face twisted into a malicious grin, his eyes gleaming with a cold, ruthless glint. In one hand, he held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the snow like a knife. In the other, he held a carving knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. "You really thought you could just leave?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is my land, Captain. And you don't belong here." Mark stepped forward, positioning himself between Kent and his family. "We're leaving, Kent. You can't stop us." Kent laughed, a low, menacing sound that sent chills down Mark's spine. "Oh, I think I can, Captain. You've trespassed on my land, and now you're going to pay the price." Mark clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way to get his family out of this. He knew he was outmatched, that they were alone in the wilderness with no one to call for help, but he refused to let Kent win. "This is your last warning, Kent," Mark said, his voice steady. "Let us go, or there will be consequences." Kent's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "You don't understand, do you? This forest, it's mine. And no one gets to leave without my permission." Before Mark could respond, Kent lunged forward, his knife flashing in the pale light. Mark barely had time to react, grabbing a fallen branch and using it to block Kent's strike. The two men struggled, their movements fierce and desperate, as Lisa and Sarah watched in horror. But Mark knew he had to protect his family, no matter what. With a final surge of strength, he shoved Kent back, sending him stumbling into the snow. "Run," Mark shouted to Lisa and Sarah. "Get to the road." They didn't hesitate, sprinting toward the road as Mark followed close behind. But as they reached the edge of the forest, Mark glanced back and saw Kent rising to his feet, his face contorted with rage. Mark didn't wait to see what Kent would do next. He grabbed Lisa and Sarah's hands, pulling them onto the road, where they began the long, treacherous journey back to civilization, leaving the dark, twisted figure of Deputy Kent behind them. But as they hurried through the snow, Mark knew that this was far from over. Kent's threat would linger in their minds for years to come, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of the forest, and the lengths one man would go to defend his twisted claim to power. A desperate flight. The snow fell harder as they hurried down the deserted road, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they trudged through the knee-deep drifts that had piled up overnight. The wind howled around them, whipping the icy flakes into their faces, stinging their skin and blurring their vision. Mark clutched Lisa's hand tightly, his other arm wrapped protectively around Sarah as he guided them forward. Every muscle in his body was tense, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see Kent's twisted figure emerging from the trees at any moment. The sense of urgency was a physical weight on his chest. Kent had made it clear. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was a hunt, and they were his prey. "Keep moving," Mark urged, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. He could feel the fatigue in Lisa's movements, her steps faltering as the snow and cold took their toll. Sarah, too, was struggling, her small frame fighting against the elements. But there was no time to rest, no time to catch their breath. They had to keep moving if they wanted to survive. The road stretched before them like a ghostly path, obscured by snow and shadows. Mark knew that if they could make it to the main road, there was a chance they might encounter another car or find a signal for their phones. But out here, so far from any signs of civilization, that hope seemed distant, almost impossible. Still, he couldn't afford to let despair creep in. He had to stay strong for his family. They stumbled onward, the trees lining the road like silent, ominous sentinels. The snowfall grew heavier, blanketing everything in an eerie silence that was broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching through the snow and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. Mark's mind raced with strategies, trying to figure out the best way to outmaneuver Kent. But out here, Kent held every advantage. He knew the land, the paths, the hiding places, and he had proven that he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure they didn't leave. Suddenly, Mark spotted a small clearing up ahead. His heart leaped at the sight. A chance to catch their breath, to regroup. "This way," he called, guiding Lisa and Sarah toward it. The clearing was shielded from the wind by a ring of pines, offering them a brief respite from the elements. They collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, their faces pale and drawn from the cold. Lisa looked at Mark, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. "Mark, how long can we keep this up? He's out there. He's following us. We can't keep running forever." Mark took a deep breath, fighting to keep his own fear at bay. "I know, Lisa, but we have to try. If we stop, if we let him catch up." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what would happen if Kent found them. Sarah looked up at him, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "Dad, can't we hide somewhere? Maybe he'll just give up." Mark shook his head, his jaw clenched. "He won't give up, Sarah. He's too far gone for that. But maybe we can outsmart him." He scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that Kent might be close. The snow had covered their tracks for the most part, which might buy them a little time. But they couldn't rely on luck alone. They needed a plan. As he considered their options, a faint sound reached his ears, a distant crunch of footsteps moving steadily toward them. His heart froze. Kent was closing in. Without a word, Mark gestured for Lisa and Sarah to follow him. They moved deeper into the trees, staying low to avoid being seen. The forest was thick here, the branches hanging low and casting deep shadows over the snow. Mark led them along a winding path, using the dense underbrush as cover. He kept one hand on Sarah's shoulder, guiding her carefully, while Lisa stayed close behind, her breathing shallow and tense. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the stillness. Mark could feel the tension in the air, a creeping sense of dread that made every step feel like a gamble. He glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of movement in the distance, a dark figure moving slowly, methodically, scanning the area with a flashlight. Kent was hunting them, his every movement precise and deliberate. Mark urged Lisa and Sarah forward, keeping to the shadows. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer as if trying to shield them from the relentless pursuit. They moved silently, their steps careful and measured. But Mark knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Kent was relentless, and if he didn't catch up with them now, he would simply wait until they were exhausted, until they had no strength left to run. As they continued through the forest, Mark spotted a narrow path branching off from the main trail, leading down a steep embankment toward a frozen stream. It was a risky move, but it offered a chance to throw Kent off their trail. He guided Lisa and Sarah down the slope, careful to keep his footing on the slippery ground. The stream was a narrow ribbon of ice cutting through the forest, its surface covered in a thin layer of snow. Mark led them onto the ice, moving quickly but carefully, hoping that the stream's winding path would make it harder for Kent to follow their tracks. The cold was biting, seeping through their clothes and chilling them to the bone, but they pressed on, their breaths coming in short, labored gasps. They followed the stream for what felt like an eternity, the cold intensifying with every step. Mark's legs ached, his muscles burning from the effort, but he refused to stop. He knew that if they could just put enough distance between themselves and Kent, they might have a chance to find shelter, to regroup and plan their next move. Finally, the stream curved sharply, leading them into a narrow ravine bordered by steep, rocky walls. Mark paused, his breath fogging in the cold air, and motioned for Lisa and Sarah to rest. They huddled together, their bodies trembling from the cold and exhaustion. Mark scanned the area, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The ravine offered some cover, but it also limited their escape routes. If Kent found them here, they would have nowhere to run. But he knew that they couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, a way to turn the tables. He knelt beside Lisa, his voice barely above a whisper. "Listen, I think I have an idea. If we can make him think we've gone in a different direction, he might lose our trail." Lisa's face was pale, her eyes filled with exhaustion, but she nodded. "What do you need us to do?" Mark looked around, spotting a fallen branch nearby. "I'll create a false trail, make it look like we headed back toward the lake. If he follows it, it might give us enough time to reach the main road." Lisa hesitated, her gaze drifting to Sarah, who was shivering in the cold. "Are you sure this will work?" Mark took her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "It's our best chance. I won't let him hurt you or Sarah. I promise." Lisa nodded, her expression resolute. She trusted him, even in this dire situation. Mark stood up, grabbing the branch and using it to brush away their tracks, creating a false trail leading back toward the lake. He worked quickly, his movements careful and precise, hoping that it would be enough to throw Kent off their scent. Once he was satisfied, he returned to Lisa and Sarah, guiding them further into the ravine. They moved slowly, staying close to the rocky walls to avoid leaving tracks in the snow. The ravine wound through the forest, its path narrow and treacherous, but Mark pushed forward, his focus unyielding. Every step felt like a victory, a small triumph in their battle for survival. Finally, as they reached the end of the ravine, Mark spotted the faint outline of the main road through the trees. Relief flooded through him, a sense of hope that had been absent since the beginning of their ordeal. They were close, so close to escaping Kent's twisted game. But as they stepped onto the road, Mark's heart sank. In the distance, he could see a figure emerging from the trees, moving toward them with slow, deliberate steps. It was Kent, his expression twisted into a dark, triumphant smile. Mark's mind raced, calculating their options. They couldn't run. Kent was too close, and they were too exhausted to outrun him. But he knew that he couldn't let this man take them, couldn't let him harm his family. He turned to Lisa, his voice steady but urgent. "Take Sarah and go. I'll hold him off." Lisa's eyes widened, her face filled with fear. "Mark, no. I can't leave you." "Go," he insisted, his voice firm. "I'll catch up with you. Just keep moving. Don't look back." Tears filled Lisa's eyes, but she nodded, taking Sarah's hand and leading her down the road. Mark watched them go, his heart heavy, but he knew it was the only way to keep them safe. As Kent approached, Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation. He knew that he was no match for Kent in this frozen wilderness, but he was determined to protect his family, no matter the cost. Kent stopped a few feet away, his smile widening as he looked Mark up and down. "You really thought you could escape, didn't you?" Mark met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep my family safe." Kent chuckled, a dark, menacing sound. "You're brave, Captain. I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you out here." Mark's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. He knew that this was a battle he couldn't win through force alone, but he also knew that he had one advantage: his love for his family, his determination to protect them. And he would use that strength to fight, to hold off this maniac long enough for Lisa and Sarah to escape. As Kent took another step forward, Mark braced himself, his body tense and ready. He had faced danger before, but this was different. This was personal. And he knew that he would stop at nothing to protect the people he loved. With a final, determined breath, Mark charged at Kent, his heart filled with the fierce resolve of a man fighting not just for himself, but for the family he held dear. A father's resolve. The snow whirled around them, the wind howling through the trees as Mark and Deputy Kent faced each other on the desolate, snow-covered road. Mark's heart pounded, every muscle in his body tense, as he prepared to protect his family, even if it meant risking his own life. In the distance, he caught a fleeting glimpse of Lisa and Sarah disappearing down the road, their figures growing smaller and smaller as they put as much distance between themselves and Kent as possible. Kent's smile was twisted, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction as he stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow. "You're a fool, Hastings. This forest belongs to me. No one leaves without my permission." Mark held his ground, his fists clenched. "It's over, Kent. You don't scare us anymore. We're leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop us." Kent's face twisted in rage, his smirk vanishing as he glared at Mark. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But out here, you're just another lost soul. No one will come to save you." Mark steadied his breath, his gaze unwavering. He could feel the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. The knowledge that Lisa and Sarah's safety depended on him holding his ground, buying them as much time as possible. He wouldn't let this man win, wouldn't let him take away the people he loved most. With a sudden, fierce resolve, Mark lunged at Kent, his body fueled by a surge of adrenaline. Kent staggered back, his expression shocked as Mark's fist connected with his jaw. The two men grappled, their bodies twisting and shifting as they fought in the snow. Mark's mind was focused, his every move driven by a fierce determination to protect his family. Kent recovered quickly, his anger giving him strength as he countered, landing a blow that sent Mark stumbling back. Pain shot through Mark's body, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to back down. He couldn't afford to falter, not now. They fought with a raw, primal intensity, their breaths coming in harsh gasps as they traded blows. Mark's fists were numb from the cold, his body aching, but he pushed past the pain, his mind fixed on one thing, keeping Kent away from his family. He thought of Lisa, of Sarah, and the life they had together, the life they deserved to return to. In a moment of desperation, Mark spotted a broken tree branch protruding from the snow nearby. He dove for it, his fingers closing around the rough wood just as Kent advanced. With a burst of strength, he swung the branch, striking Kent across the shoulder. Kent let out a shout of pain, staggering back as he clutched his shoulder, his eyes blazing with fury. "You'll pay for that," Kent snarled, his voice a low growl. Mark didn't respond. He was beyond words, beyond fear. His only focus was on survival, on protecting his family. He advanced on Kent, his gaze steely, the branch held tightly in his hands. Kent's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. For the first time, he seemed to realize that Mark wouldn't back down, that he was willing to fight to the bitter end. In a desperate attempt to turn the tables, Kent lunged forward, his hands reaching for Mark's throat. But Mark was ready. He sidestepped, swinging the branch again with all his strength. The branch connected with Kent's side, sending him sprawling to the ground, his body hitting the snow with a heavy thud. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of Mark's ragged breathing. He stood over Kent, his chest heaving, his heart pounding in his chest. Kent lay still, his face twisted in pain, his body sprawled out in the snow. Mark dropped the branch, his hand shaking as he took a step back. He felt a surge of relief, a wave of exhaustion washing over him as he realized that he had done it. He had protected his family, kept them safe from this man's twisted, relentless pursuit. But as he turned to leave, he heard a low, dark chuckle. Mark froze, his heart sinking as he turned back to see Kent slowly pushing himself up, a cold, twisted smile on his face. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, staining the snow beneath him, but his eyes were filled with a dangerous, unyielding resolve. "You think this is over?" Kent sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you can just walk away?" Mark felt a surge of frustration and exhaustion, but he refused to give in to fear. "Stay down, Kent. You've lost." But Kent merely laughed, a hollow, menacing sound that echoed through the trees. "You don't get it, do you? This forest, it's part of me. It's in my blood. And I'll never stop. Not until you're all gone." Mark took a step back, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't keep fighting like this. Kent was relentless, driven by a dark obsession that went beyond anything Mark could comprehend. He had to end this. Now. As Kent advanced again, Mark made a quick decision. He turned and sprinted down the road, his feet pounding against the snow as he put as much distance as possible between himself and Kent. He could hear Kent's footsteps behind him, closing in, but he pushed himself harder, his mind focused on one thing: leading Kent away from his family. The road curved sharply, leading down a narrow, snow-covered path that wound through the dense forest. Mark followed the path, his heart pounding as he ducked under low-hanging branches, the snow blinding him as he moved deeper into the woods. He could still hear Kent's footsteps behind him, but he forced himself to keep moving, drawing Kent further and further from Lisa and Sarah. Finally, he reached a small clearing at the edge of a steep cliff, the ground dropping away to reveal a frozen river far below. Mark skidded to a stop, his breath coming in gasps as he turned to face Kent, who was only a few yards away, his face twisted in a triumphant smile. "You're trapped, Hastings," Kent sneered, advancing slowly. "There's nowhere left to run." Mark glanced behind him, his mind racing. The cliff was a sheer drop, the river below frozen solid. There was no way down, no escape, but he knew he couldn't give in, couldn't let Kent win. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and met Kent's gaze. "If you want me, you'll have to come and get me." Kent's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but he shrugged it off, advancing with a dark, determined look in his eyes. "You're finished, Captain. This is where it ends." Mark held his ground, his mind calm, his focus unwavering. He knew what he had to do. As Kent closed the distance between them, Mark sidestepped at the last moment, using Kent's own momentum against him. Kent staggered forward, his balance lost as he teetered on the edge of the cliff. For a brief, terrifying moment, he flailed, his arms pinwheeling as he tried to regain his footing. But it was too late. With a final, desperate shout, Kent slipped, his body plunging over the edge of the cliff. Mark watched as he fell, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the darkness below. The forest was silent, the only sound the faint howl of the wind. Mark stood there, his body trembling as the weight of everything that had happened finally settled over him. He took a deep breath, feeling the surge of relief, of exhaustion, of triumph. It was over. Kent was gone, and his family was safe. He turned and began the long, difficult journey back to the road, his mind focused on one thing: reuniting with Lisa and Sarah. Every step was heavy, his body aching from the fight, but he pushed himself forward, driven by the thought of seeing his family's faces, of holding them close and knowing that they were safe. When he finally reached the road, he saw Lisa and Sarah waiting for him, their faces filled with relief and joy as they ran toward him. He wrapped his arms around them, holding them close as he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "It's over," he murmured, his voice thick with relief. "We're safe." Lisa hugged him tightly, her eyes filled with tears. "I knew you'd come back," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Sarah clung to him, her small arms wrapped around his neck as she buried her face in his shoulder. "Dad, I was so scared." Mark held her close, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I know, sweetheart, but we're together now, and we're going home." They made their way down the road, their steps slow but steady as they left the forest behind. The sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the landscape, melting away the shadows and illuminating the path ahead. Mark felt a sense of peace, of closure, as he looked back one last time at the forest, knowing that they had survived, that they had escaped the darkness.